Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the semifinals of the Chess Champions Tour Grand Final in the great year of 2024. Now, in the semifinals, we have Alireza Firouzja playing against Jan Nepomniachtchi, but in the big matchup, we have Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, the #2 Frenchman, playing against Magnus Carlsen. Now, Magnus has looked invincible in this event. He won 6 out of his 7 matches in the qualification stages, and it looks like he is the clear favorite. So, the players are playing a 6-game match, perhaps a little bit long for some people, but at any rate, it is what it is. 3 games with white and 3 games with black. So in the first game, Magnus has the white piece as usual, since he is the highest rated player in the tournament, and the game starts out with the move c4. Maxime plays g6, we get g3, c5, bishop g2, bishop g7, and now the move knight c3. Here Maxime plays knight to f6, and now we get the unusual move knight h3. Now, if Maxime had played knight c6 here, we would be playing the classic mirror, mirror on the wall. The players have played the exact same setup, and Magnus would be forced to make a decision on where he wants to put his knight. But because Maxime plays knight f6 first, now Magnus says, you know what, I don't like the mirror, I don't like symmetrical positions, I'm going to put my knight on h3, and now with my knight on h3, going to f4, it will be better than your horse on f6. So we get the move knight c6. Magnus plays knight f4, we get d6, b3, and now we have the move castles. Magnus castles, and we get the move rook b8. Now here it is abundantly clear that Maxime wants to potentially play b6 and bishop b7 here, but on top of that, you would also argue that maybe you can go e5 and harass this knight on f4. So we get bishop b2. Maxime plays a6 here, and now we get the move d3, and the game continues with bishop d7. Magnus plays queen d2, and now we get the move b5. Now, what Maxime has opted to do, instead of trying to fianchetto the bishop on b7, he puts the bishop on d7, and his argument is that he's going to try to use this b file for the rook. So now we get knight c d5. Maxime plays e6, we get takes, takes, and now we get takes, takes. And at this point, after e3, we're pretty much in the middle game here. It's a very closed sort of position. However, there's a lot of dynamic play here because white can potentially play d4 to open up the center, or if black takes on c4, you can take with the d pawn to pressure the pawn on d6. So there's a lot of play in the center, and once the center explodes, the game will become very unclear. So here we get rook f d8. Magnus plays rook c1, and now we get the move pawn takes pawn. We have the move d takes c4, Magnus trying to pressure the pawn on d6, and now we get the move knight to e5. After knight to e5 is played, we get the move rook f d1, and now Maxime plays the move bishop c6. Now, even though Maxime lost in the qualification stage to Magnus, he was one of only 2 players who had serious chances to win the match, and at this point in the game, it's looking like Maxime is showing like he might be one of the few players who is not afraid of Magnus and perhaps not suffering from the Magnus effect. So after bishop c6, we get takes, takes, and now the move knight d3 is played, and here Maxime plays a5. Now at this point, you'll notice the computer prefers black's position, and the reason for that is that white is struggling to do anything in the center of the board. Black's idea is to play a4, open up the b file for the rook. There's also d5 here as well to open up the d file. So black controls all the pawn breaks in the center of the board. It's worth noting that if white were to play e4 here, black can play knight to d4, creating the classic bastion. There are all kinds of forks here, and because white is missing the fianchettoed bishop, your king is all alone, and you have these light square weaknesses around the king. So Magnus goes h4. Now we get the move a4 from Maxime, and this is an excellent move to play. I would say that in 90% of games that are played at the Grandmaster level, when you have an opponent who plays a move like h4, whether it's with all the pieces on the board, whether it's in an endgame, almost always you're going to auto respond by playing h5 to stop your opponent from pushing p with h5 and h6. But Maxime goes a4, and he's going for it. He's trying to open up the file for the rook, maybe try to create a kebab on the second rank, and it's looking like Magnus could be in a little bit of trouble. So Magnus goes rook b1. We get takes, takes, and now we get the move rook a8. Here Maxime trying to take advantage of the fact that white cannot play rook to a1. If white can't move the rook over, black can try to stack the rooks, say rook a7 and rook a8, create the double stack, and infiltrate with the kebab once again. So we get king g2. Maxime plays h5 now to stop white from pushing forward, and we get the move queen e2. Maxime plays rook b8, logical move, trying to pressure the pawn on b3, use the open file for this rook, and in the meantime, because white has this clumsy knight on d3, the pawn on d6 simply can't be attacked easily. So Magnus goes knight f4. Now we get rook back to d8, and here we have the move rook d2 being played. Maxime plays the move king f8, and this is the start of going for a plan that frankly I think is a little bit too ambitious. There's nothing wrong with king f8 in this position, but it is not the right way to try and defend the pawn. What Maxime should have played is a move like knight to b4 here, and after rook d1 and rook to a6, the rooks guard the pawn on d6, the knight takes away some squares from the rook here, and you still keep an eye on this open a file. Now, is black better? No, not at all, but at least the moves here become pretty straightforward versus the game where Maxime decides to play like a streamer. So we get king f8, rook b d1, logical move, pressure the pawn, and now Maxime plays move king e7. Now, as I mentioned during my live commentary on my Kick channel, it feels to me like this is Maxime trying to be a little bit too flashy. Perhaps he's been watching streamers too much and forgetting that they are not professional players, so you should not try to do what they do on stream, because when he goes for this bomb cloud setup, the king on e7 is okay, but at the end of the day, as we're about to see, there are going to be some serious issues. So we get the move queen f3. Maxime plays rook a6, logical, guarding the knight. Now we get this move rook d5 from Magnus, and this is a really flashy move, but it's a move that I actually like a lot, because when you look at the time situation here, you'll notice that time is approximately equal. Both players have about a minute and 15 seconds, but black's moves are not as easy, primarily because now that you've put the king in the center with the bond cloud, you can't take the rook here, because then knight takes with fork the king and the queen. You also can't move the king, because then you hang the pawn, and now there are ideas with queen e4 to pin the pawn on e6, and it's getting a little bit dicey. Now, it's still completely fine for black, but you're going to have to be precise, and with time winding down, it's not easy, because you also don't want to spend 30 seconds, get too low to where you're simply unable to play and defend for the rest of the game. So now we get this move rook d7. This is the first move that's really unnecessary. If I were playing here, I probably would have considered a move like knight to b4, because the knight guards the rook on a6, the rooks again guard the pawn on d6, and now white's probably gonna have to play a move like rook d2 or queen e4. But after queen e4, now you can simply sit and wait with the rook, because this knight will always be covering this d5 square. Instead, we get rook d7. Now Magnus plays queen to e4, and here we get the move knight e5. Now this is a slight mistake, not a big mistake, but a slight mistake in the position. Again, I think knight to b4 might have been okay here, simply holding the rook and attacking, but we get knight e5. Now we get rook takes c5, and here Magnus Carlsen sacks the rook because of a classic pin idea. We get pawn takes rook, rook takes rook, and now Maxime collapses with this move king takes rook. Now, I'm not going to blame Maxime. He's getting low on time. It's a natural human move, but oddly enough, after king to f8 here, white is only slightly better after, say, rook c7 and rook a2, because there's a lot of counterplay with knight to g4 hitting this pawn. You also have queen to b2 potentially, and this king on g2 is a little bit weak. Instead, Maxime takes the rook with the king. If he were to play knight takes here, now there's knight to d5, forking the king and the queen. You can't capture because of the pin, and once you lose the queen here, you are simply going to lose the game, as a queen is much more valuable than a rook and a knight combined. So Maxime ends up taking. Now we get queen b7 check, checking the king, attacking the rook. We got king e8 takes, and at this point the dust has settled. Magnus is simply up a pawn on the queen side. His king is very safe. Pawn on c5 is loose. A lot of check ideas to try and win this pawn on c5, and here it is simply a disaster. So we get queen f5. Now we have queen c8 being played. Maxime goes king e7. Magnus captures the juicer. Now he's up 2 pawns on the queen side. This is a pretty basic endgame, and we know that Magnus will win the game. So we get king e8. Now we have queen to d4 played, and here Maxime goes knight g4. Magnus plays e4, we get queen to a5, and now we have the move knight to h3. Now, it's a very logical move here, because the one good piece that black has is the knight on g4, but the knight here guards the base of the chain, and now you try to use the queen to escort these 2 pawns up the board. So we get queen b4. Magnus plays knight g5, and now we have the move queen e1. If Maxime were to take this pawn on b3, white is simply winning after the move queen to g7, as black has no good way to guard this pawn. If you try queen b7, there's check, takes, and here at the very least, white can go into this endgame where you have 5 pawns versus 2. You're going to go knight f4, knight f8 with f4 ideas. Black is just lost. So we get queen to e1. Now we have the move c5 from Magnus, queen still guarding the pawn, and here we get e5. Magnus plays queen a4, Maxime goes king f8, and now we get the move queen to a2, guarding the pawn on f2 from the side, but also setting up a very devious idea of b4 to now threaten this checkmate on f7. So it's a gigantic 90-degree right triangle. Now at this point, after queen a2, Maxime plays the move f6. This is a blunder which leads to a forced checkmate, but frankly it doesn't matter what he does here. Even if time were even with 5 seconds each, you are going to lose the game. So he goes f6, we get check, king e7, check, king d8, and now Magnus plays knight e6. Now there are many different paths to checkmate, but this is probably the flashiest. We get king e8, check, king e7, and now we have the move queen d8. And here Maxime Vachier-Lagrave resigns the first game to Magnus Carlsen, because if he goes king f7, you check, forcing the king to eat the horse on e6, and after the king eats the horse, there's queen to e8, checkmating the king. There are no squares available. The pawns cover all the critical spots, and you lose the game. So after we get queen to d8 being played, Maxime resigns the game. With that, Magnus takes a 1-0 lead in the best of 6. So now we're going to move to the second game of the match. Now Maxime has white here against Magnus. They alternate with every game, and the game starts out with e4. Magnus plays c5, we get knight to f3, and now we have the move g6. Now when I was doing the live coverage of this game on my channel, I actually was starting to get very confused, because you might not have noticed this if you haven't watched my channel much, and if you have, you would notice this, of course, which is that Magnus is suddenly trying to play like Hikaru. Now, I don't know the reasoning for this. Earlier in the tournament, Magnus was playing knight f3, e3, b3. Now he plays the Sicilian, this hyper-accelerated dragon with c5 and g6. This is a system that Hikaru used in the candidates. He also played it against none other than Maxime Vachier-Lagrave in the global chess league, which was held in London in October. I do have a recap video, I believe, of that game on the channel. But Magnus suddenly thinks he's Hikaru. Now, it's very awkward to see. It's very surprising, but I would also say there is a classic quote out there, which is that flattery is imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. I believe it's something like that. I might have the quote wrong a little bit, but there is that phrase out there. So now we get c3. Now we have d5, e5, and now Magnus plays the move a6. Now, Hikaru has played this position from the black side a couple of times. In the candidates against the current 18th world chess champion, Hikaru played the move bishop to g4, and he had some chances to be better in that game. It would end in a draw, whereas in the Grand Swiss back in 2023, Hikaru played the move a6, which is what Magnus plays here. So now we get h3. The idea behind h3 is that since black stops white from going bishop b5, now white stops black from going bishop g4. Both sides are saying, "Niet, we want no pins in this position." So now we get knight c6. d4 is played, we get bishop g7, and here Maxime plays the move g3. Now in the aforementioned game from the Grand Swiss between Andrei Yesipenko and Hikaru Nakamura, that game continued with the move bishop e2. It would end in a draw fairly early, but the game was quite rich. Instead, we get to move g3. Now, g3 is also a move that I had looked at that time, so it shouldn't come as a big surprise. But here, Magnus spends 2 minutes before playing bishop f5. Now, I am making a joke when I say this, of course, so understand we're making a video and it's all in good fun. But I was wondering, maybe Magnus has literally just been looking at Hikaru's games. He maybe is on his computer, he's just looking at the last 100 games Hikaru has played, and he's just looking at them, and that's all he's doing in terms of preparation. Because he spends 2 minutes before playing this move. So maybe he's aware of bishop e2 from that Hikaru game. At any rate, the show goes on. So we get bishop f5 from Magnus. Now we have the move bishop g2. And here we get the move e6. Now we get the move castles from MVL, and here we have knight e7, and now we get bishop e3 being played. Now it's very clear to me that Maxime was surprised by this opening choice. He thought he was playing Magnus Carlsen, not that random streamer guy. But it's already a very delicate situation, because if white is not very careful here, black has this nice bishop, this wooden shield outside the pawn chain. For example, you'll notice the bishop here, it targets everything. If I were to go back and just play a position like this, for example, you'll notice this bishop is very passive. It is walled in by all the pawns. But now in this position here, the bishop is simply outside, and it's a very good piece. So you have to know exactly what you're doing, and bishop e3 just isn't it. Now the computer wants rook e1, and I suspect he was worried about something like takes, and something like knight b4 down the road, with all kinds of forks here looming in this position. But that being said, if black plays knight b4, you can ignore it with knight c3, because after knight to c2, you have the very nasty move g4, attacking the bishop. Black takes the rook, you take back, bishop e4, f3, and suddenly this bishop is getting trapped on the light squares. Instead, we get bishop e3. Magnus goes queen b6, very thematic move, pressuring the pawn on b2, pressuring the pawn on d4, and now we get g4 being played. Bishop e4, we get queen b3, takes, and now we have the move pawn takes pawn. Here Maxime takes back, we get takes, and now we get this move f6. Now at this point, the dust has settled from the opening phase. We're in the middle game, but you'll notice right off here that black is much better because this b on f3 is very passive. It's targeting pawns which are guarded. Black's a knight and a bishop hitting the pawn on d4, and white has these ugly double pawns on b2 and b3. So we're in a middle game. Magnus is better. He loves these sorts of positions. You're expecting him to go and win the game very quickly. So we get rook d1. Magnus plays knight b4, and this is the first move that actually to me came as a bit of a surprise here. I thought something like king d7 right away, or maybe even g5 with knight g6, knight f4, knight h4 felt a little bit more thematic than what happens, because when Magnus goes knight b4, we get rook to d2 here, stopping knight c2, and now we get to move knight c6. Now you might be thinking, well, these knights, they look very well placed, and they are well placed, but what you'll notice here is that you have one horse hitting this pawn on d4, but the knight on b4 is actually not doing anything. It is a bastion, it's on b4, but there are no squares for the horse to go to, whereas if we go back to this position, you already have horse hitting the pawn, so now you have a free hand to start moving the knight every which way here, and improve the placement. So Magnus kind of wastes a couple of moves to get the other knight to c6 to hit the pawn, but now he has a knight on b4 that is simply misplaced. So we get rook f8, MVL plays king g2 to guard this bishop against any threats on the f file here potentially, and now we get king d7. Now Maxime plays knight to a4, and already here you start to see why these knights are not on the best squares, because MVL is threatening knight b6 and knight c5, a lot of big forks lurking in the position, and it's very, very dangerous. So we get rook e8. Knight c5 is played, we get king c7, and now we have the move g5. Here Maxime is expanding the pawns on the king side. He's also intending to play bishop g4, targeting the pawn on e6, and now if anybody is better, it is definitely white. So we get bishop g7, bishop g4, Magnus plays e5, and now we get pawn takes pawn. Now, if MVL were to play the move knight e6, you're probably thinking, why not? Knight e6, fork the king, the rook, and the bishop, right? Win the rook and win the game. But here, black can sack the rook takes knight, and after takes, the knight and the bishop guard the pawn on d4. You can't go to f4 without being captured. So inevitably, you will lose this b, and once you lose this b, let's just say bishop g4 takes, black will have two knights for the tower, and the two knights here are much better. So we get d takes e5. Now we have bishop takes e5 being played, and here Maxime plays the move rook to e2. Now Magnus goes d4, we get bishop d2, and at this point it's very, very hard to play because suddenly the bishops are alive on the diagonals. You have a knight that's jumping to e6 or d7 here, and you're also going to stack the rooks on e1. White's pieces have achieved perfect harmony, and black's knights are very passive. There's no real threat here, and at any rate, it's going to be very hard to defend, and to add insult to injury, Magnus's time is starting to get a little bit low. So now we get d3, rook to e4, Magnus takes, and now we get to move rook a e1. And at this point, you'll notice that all of black's pieces are under attack. The knight on b4 is under attack. There's knight e6 with a fork. The rook on e8 is under attack. Simply all of black's pieces are lacking in coordination. So we get takes. Magnus plays king d6, we get bishop takes b4, knight takes b4, and now the very important in-between move, knight takes pawn to check the king. King would love to go here to guard the knight, but the knight covers a square, so you have to move forward. And after rook takes b4, white is simply up a knight here. Maxime is also up 2 minutes on the clock. Surely he is going to win this game without breaking a sweat and even the match at one apiece. So Magnus goes d2 here, desperado move, trying to push his p, hoping for some kind of miracle to get a queen on d1. Now Maxime spends about 1 minute on the clock before playing this horrible move, knight a5. Now pretty much any move should be winning here, any normal move. Probably the cleanest one is to go f4 here, primarily because when you go f4, the rook guards the pawn, but now you can try to check this king on f3, force the king away, and black's king, once it has to go backwards, there will be no threats at all. You check the king, you guard d1, it should be GG. You can't play bishop f3 right away because then black would sack the rook, and after takes, black gets the queen and wins the game. So rather inexplicably, up 2 minutes on the clock, MVL has all the time in the world, and now he falls prey to the classic Magnus effect, and he makes a blunder with knight a5. Now here Magnus spends 1 minute before playing this move, bishop d4, and I'm going to be honest, even though bishop d4 is the best move, this is the fatal error that loses Magnus the game here because of the situation on the clock. Now, this is the best move. I'm rather surprised Magnus didn't play it right away. Maybe he thought there was some bishop c3 idea or something along these lines, but he spends far too long before playing this move, because now after knight c4 he blunders away the game with this move rook takes f2. The move that Magnus should have played here was this move rook to f4, threatening to sack the rook for the bishop and get a queen and win the game. Now, the reason this is so strong is that if white goes bishop to d1 here, for example, now you take the pawn, white goes king g3, and after rook to f1 you're attacking the bishop, you're threatening to push the pawn forward, and white's gonna have to play something like bishop e2, take, and go rook b7. But now material is even, both sides have 3 pawns on the board, and the game should end in a draw. So Magnus plays rook f2. Now, as I said before, time matters a lot, and when you get too low on time, even if you reach the position where it's possible to save the game, you're not going to be able to find the best moves in most of these situations unless you have 30 seconds or more. So we get rook f2. Now after king g3, Maxime is on his way to a dub here, it would seem, because the bishop covers d1. Now you have no way to dislodge this bishop. You can't go rook f4 here because I take the rook and win the game. If you go rook f1, then I take the pawn on d2. So it's looking like Maxime is going to win here very cleanly, barring a second missed opportunity. So we get rook f8. Maxime here plays move knight takes d2, and this is just an unacceptable blunder by any level of the game, as I would put it. This is simply unacceptable. You cannot play this move. You have 242 versus 17. You're covering the square, but Maxime plays it, and he just misses a very nice little nuanced tactic here, where Magnus tickles the king with bishop to f2. We get king g2, and now after bishop c5, you're attacking the rook on b4, but you're also threatening to go for the kebab with rook to f2, checking the king on g2, and saving the game sort of out of thin air. Now, it's very clear that MVL got lazy here. He thought the game was over, and the only tactic was bishop c3, attacking the rook and the knight. But after bishop c3, rook b7, takes, rook d7, this is very easily winning. Now, it's also why when you play Magnus, you have to be so careful, because he is always finding these resources, always trying to keep the game going, and MVL just walks right into it. Now, fortunately for MVL here, you'll notice that because of the time situation, Magnus only has 20 seconds on the clock. There is a 2-second increment, of course, but it's going to be difficult to play nonetheless. So we get rook b7, check, king g3, takes, and now we get the move rook takes h7. And here, Magnus plays bishop d6. Now, the position here remains equal. It should be a draw with perfect play, but the more precise way to approach this was to go king e4, because there's no check on e7. You're threatening to check on d6 or f2 here, and the white king on g3 is a little bit vulnerable. Instead, we get bishop d6, king f3 played, not king h4, by the way, because after king h4, maybe it's still a draw, but after rook d3, there's suddenly this big threat with bishop g3 checkmate, and the king is very weak on the edge of the board. So we get king f3. Check, king e2, takes, and now we have rook g7. Here, MVL is trying to win this pawn on g6 and push his p up the board and win the game. So we get king e4 here. This is a move that I actually don't love in this position. I think that rook b2 right away would have been better, because after king d1 check, king c2, you can play rook b2 check, sacking the rook. If white ever takes, you have check, winning the rook and drawing the game. And so white basically can't dodge it. You just decide, you know what, I'm just going to check your king all over the board here. If king c1, there's bishop f4 as well, and there's really no way for white to dodge all the checks. Now, do I fault Magnus for missing this? Not at all. It's not easy to find, but it would lead to an instant draw. So we get the move king e4. We got takes, rook b2, king d1, and now Magnus plays the move bishop f4. We get rook to e6, king to d3, and this is a move after which it's very hard to defend. Frankly, even if I were playing this, or anyone were playing this with maybe more time on the clock, the correct line the computer likes here with bishop e5 saving the game is just not very human, because after g6, rook b7 to cut off the pawn, you think, well, white takes this pawn on a6, white has 2 pawns, you're just losing. But because the pawns are so far advanced here, if black can get some position like this, for example, with the bishop on g7, you're blockading these pawns. White will struggle to push the p through, for example, and if you blockade here, this will end in a peaceful result. Magnus goes king d3. Now we get bishop f5, king c3. You can't go back to d4 c4 because of the check winning the bishop. So we get king c3, g6, and now bishop h6 is played. Maxime takes the pawn, and now we get king d4, and here we have the move rook e6. Now this move is a blunder. It's not the best move. I don't really blame MVL. Rook to a7 would have been the winning line, because after rook to b5, rook f7 here, you're just going to bring your king back, try to push the pawn, should be winning in the long run, but you know, that's what it is. Instead, we get rook e6. Magnus goes rook f2. We get bishop g4. And now we have the move king d5. Here we get rook to e7. We get rook f6. And this move is the last moment where Magnus could have perhaps saved the game. He plays rook f6. We get g7, rook g6. And now the all-star finisher, rook to e6. Probably Magnus saw queen takes bishop e6, king d6, which still saves the game. But after rook to e6, the bishop guards the rook. Rook hits both the rook on g6 and the bishop here. If you take, I get a queen and win. And Magnus decides to take the bishop here. MVL captures, and now we get the move bishop takes pawn. If you take the rook, white queens and wins the game. So we get takes, rook to e8, and here Magnus Carlsen resigns the game because after bishop e5 and g5, if you try to run the king up the board, g6, king f5, I sack the rook, and after takes, the pawn gets through to become a queen. So Magnus resigns this game, which means the match is level at 1-1. Now in the third game with the white pieces, Magnus would win once again. The fourth game would end in a draw, and we're now going to move into the fifth game where the score is 2.5, 1.5 in favor of Magnus. If he wins this game, he wins the match and advances to grand final. If it's a draw, they will play game number 6. Magnus plays e4. We get Sicilian from MVL, c3 here, and now we get d5, takes, d4, knight f6, knight f3, and the move knight c6. Now, the Alapin Sicilian has become one of Magnus's favorites, Alapin or c3 Sicilian, where you push this pawn to c3. He's used it effectively in many situations where he needs to avoid a loss, probably the most prominent one being the World Cup against D. Gukesh, the second game of that match in I believe it was Baku, Azerbaijan last year, where he played this in a situation where he needed to avoid a loss. Generally, it's considered a very, very solid setup here because you build this mini center, you develop the pieces very easily, and there's a lot of free-flowing play. So we get bishop e2. Now we get e6, castles, bishop e7, and Magnus goes c4. We get queen d8, takes, castles, and the move knight c3. We get takes, a3, and now the move a5 to try and stop white from expanding with b4. Magnus goes knight a4, we get bishop to a7, and now we get bishop to f4. Here you'll notice that white's b's are a little bit more active than the black b's, so white can be better in the long run, but what black wants to do is eventually push e5, take advantage of having this kingside majority, the 4-on-3, and advance, or not advance, but open up the diagonal for the light square bishop. So here we get bishop d7, knight c3, bishop b8, and now we get the move queen c1. Maxime trying to get rid of this bishop so that he can start pushing his p with e5. So we get queen c1, takes, we get queen b8, and now Magnus plays the move queen e3. Here we get the move a4. This is a move designed to stop white from ever playing b4. If you were to play something like knight e7 and white gets b4, perhaps white can use this 2-on-1 majority on the queen side down the road to win the game. So we get a4 here. Of course, the point being that if white were to go b4, this would be a very poor move in modern day chess. 600 years ago, a4 would have been a clean blunder because of b4, but in modern day chess, if you play b4, there's a classic maneuver or the glitch move and peasant with pawn takes pawn, and now black is much better. So we get the move rook a d1. Now we have knight e7 here. Maxime trying to activate his b and rotate his horse to f5 or g6. We got bishop d3, bishop c6, knight e5, and now we get the move rook a5, trying to activate the rook and target the horse on e5. Magnus plays rook e1, we got h6, and now we have the move bishop c2. This move is designed to pressure the pawn on a4, but also to potentially line up a double A battery with queen d3. We got knight f5, queen to e2 here, and now we have the move queen a7. Magnus takes the knight, we get takes, and now Magnus plays the move h3, creating the classic Lufthansa here for the king to escape to h2, but also it stops black from ever playing knight g4. Now we get the move queen c5, and here Magnus plays queen e7. Now I was covering this live. I thought a small advantage for white, nothing super special. Both players have plenty of time on the clock. And what Magnus is hoping for is obviously this classic endgame where the queens get traded, you put the rook on d2, and you hope to play against these weak pawns on a4 and c6. So it's looking like we're going to get an endgame, and I'm covering it very, very relaxed. I explained there's one tactic in the position that you want to avoid with black. Then to my surprise, we get this move queen takes c4 played after a 1 minute and 40-second think by MVL, and this move loses the game on the spot. Magnus is going to win. He's going to be in the grand final, and everything is all set. So, of course, if you guys want to pause the video and figure out what the move is, I will let you guys take a few seconds. All right, so hopefully those of you guys who paused the video to take a look and figure it out, you have realized the reason that queen takes c4 is a big blunder. And the reason this is a big blunder is there is queen takes rook. You can go for a Botez gambit here, sacking the queen, and after takes, rook to d8, knight e8 takes, the king gets checkmated here. This is a classic ice skater checkmate. King has nowhere to go. It's game over. So MVL spends 1 minute and 40 seconds before playing this move, and this is another clear example of the Magnus effect. Now, one of the things about Magnus is he might be the best player in the world, but he oftentimes struggles to see mate in ones or mate in twos, some of these very basic mating ideas, as we saw on a Title Tuesday some months back when he missed a very simple checkmate in one against yours truly in Title Tuesday. So perhaps Magnus, maybe we could say he's the greatest player of all time, but it's clear that one of his biggest weaknesses is missing checkmates in one. So after queen takes c4, we get this move rook to d8. I have no explanation for this. I'm sure Magnus was asked about this after the game. This move is still good for white, but now you're going to have to win the game again. We get the move knight to h7 here, guarding the rook on f8, and now we get rook e d1. Here we get queen e6 from MVL, and now Magnus trades the queens and goes rook d6. Now, maybe Magnus can just see the future better than all the rest of us, and he knew he would find a way to win the game anyway, but looking for better than a mate in one, that is really a Giga Chad move. I'm not going to lie, it's not something that I would think of doing, but maybe Magnus just knows he's that good, and he has to look for better than ending the game immediately. So, white is a little bit better here, but it is an endgame after all. We get rook b8, and now we have to move rook to d2 here. White is temporarily down a pawn, but you're going to lose either the c6 or e6 pawns on the next turn. So we get e5, takes, knight f6, and now Magnus plays rook c4. We get rook ba8, and the move f3. Now here material is balanced, but there is a slight pull for white, primarily because you have a 2-on-1 on the queen side. This pawn is under a lot of pressure. If you ever lose this pawn, just to illustrate it, white will start pushing his p up the board and win the game. So there's still some pull. Black also is struggling to make use of the pawns in the center of the board. You can't easily create a passed pawn because white has 3 pieces covering the e4 square. So we get rook a7, king f2 played by Magnus. We get this move king h7, and now we have the move rook d6. We get e4 here from MVL, and this is a blunder. At this point, it's clear that MVL cracks. He's under a lot of pressure because the rooks are stuck guarding this pawn on a4. He can't really push easily. He looks for instant counterplay before he gets too low on the clock by playing this move. But after takes and rook b7, it's very clear that what Maxime missed here is this move rook to b4. It stops black from taking the pawn. If black were to trade after takes rook e5, white can simply trade, go king e2, and now you're going to start pushing your p. The a4 pawn is going to fall. It is an utter disaster. So we get rook e7. Magnus plays rook d4, another excellent move here, ensuring that he will win the pawn on a4, but much more importantly, black will end up with this pawn on e4, which is always a weakness. Just to illustrate the point, if white were to take here, for example, and you get some position like this, at this point, black has a ton of counterplay after rook e1 and rook ff1 here. You're threatening rook h1. Black has no weaknesses on the king side. So even if white is somehow able to win this pawn on a4, black's position is very compact. But when we get this version, now you'll notice here that white has the 2 pawns on the outside to push, but now you have a weakness on e4, which white is also threatening to capture. So we get e3. King e2, we get rook e5, and now Magnus plays the move g4. Another excellent move here because now the knight is struggling to move. There are no good squares, no jumps here for this horse on f6. And now positionally speaking, or not positionally, technically speaking, this should be a win. So we get h5. Rook c4 is played, we get king g6, and now Magnus starts pushing his p on the queen side. He has 2 connected juicers. Once they get rolling, black will lose the game. So we get king g5, and now we have this move a4, and king h4 is played. Here, Magnus plays g5, an excellent move. He sacrifices his extra pawn here, but it kills all of the black counterplay. After king takes pawn, a5 is played. The knight still cannot get to f4, g3. What you really need is you need something like this, where the knight is getting to g3 or f4 to pressure the white king, which is blockading this pawn. But after g5 takes an a5, this knight is still stuck. You need this knight getting to these squares, f4, g3, and because you have no access points, the white pawns, which are just marching up the board, are much too fast. We get rook f5, Magnus plays knight e4, another excellent move here, potentially trading off the knights. White now is a 2 connected, still ready to rush up the board, and at this point, MVL could already resign. He plays the move rook f1, We got to move king d2 here, breaking the pin on the e file. We got rook h1, takes, and now we got to move rook d3. At this point, you'll probably notice black potentially has a passed pawn, but it's very far back, and both f4 and f3 are covered by D's rooks here, so you still have to worry about the 2 pawns going up the board. We got to move rook a1, Magnus plays king c2. We got this move rook e2, king b3. Now we get rook a2, and here we have rook f4 being played. This is maybe the last moment where Magnus could have made a mistake, but it's a very elegant solution to the problem, because what Magnus is doing here is the rook guards the pawn, pressures the pawn on f6, but there's a third very important point here, which is that white now wants to run the king to c4 and b5. So if you got check, and king b5, now the king is very safe, it's protected, you're pushing the pawn up the board, and the game ends very soon. So after rook f4, we get this move rook eb2. Now we have king c4, we got king g5, Magnus plays rook f3, and at this point, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave resigns this game here because he's losing the pawn on f6, the king is escorting the 2 pawns up the board, and there is simply no hope left to save the game. So with this victory, Magnus wins the match by a score of 3.5 to 1.5. He moves into the grand final, where he will play Jan Nepomniachtchi from Russia, who dominated Alireza Firouzja today, beating him in the best of 6 match by a score of 3.5 to half. So what to say, but Magnus doing Magnus things as always, showing that mate in ones, what are those? You don't want to end a game, you always look for better. So I think this should be one of the great phrases that we attribute to Magnus. When you have mate in one, always look for better. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap from the semifinals of the 2024 Chess Champions Tour final being held in Oslo, Norway. If you are not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with a recap when Magnus plays against Nepo tomorrow in a rematch of the 2021 World Chess Championship match. Hope you guys enjoy it. Have a great rest of your day. See you. Bye.